This video introduces how CA Single Sign-On, as OpenID Connect Provider uses Discovery Profile for provider metadata. CA Single Sign-On now supports Discovery Profile of OIDC configuration and publishes well-known endpoint. OIDC client or relying party can use this endpoint to dynamically retrieve the metadata of an authorization provider that is configured with the client. The metadata includes the following details in JSON format: URLs of supported endpoints, scopes and claims that are configured in the client, supported response types and response modes, certificates information, along with supported algorithms, and so on. Now, let us take a deeper look at how you can use the metadata. OIDC clients that display multiple authentication providers to end users send requests to OIDC provider based on the end user choice. Such clients can use the metadata to construct requests to specific endpoints, as required. If a client or mobile OIDC SDK does not have the provision to configure client information, they can use the metadata information of endpoints, claims, and scopes to build dynamic requests, and receive authorization code and tokens from CA Single Sign-On OpenID Connect Provider. Then, if a client does not store public certificates of OpenID Connect Provider, client can use the JWKS endpoint in the metadata to retrieve the public key during runtime, for signature verification of ID token. Let us see a quick demo on how the provider metadata looks like. In this demonstration, you'll see how to retrieve provider metadata endpoint URL, retrieve user claims using the provider metadata endpoint. Let us begin. When you create a client, CA Single Sign-On now displays a provider metadata endpoint URL, along with the other endpoint URLs. Let us use this endpoint to retrieve provider metadata. When you open the endpoint in a web browser, you will retrieve the provider metadata, that is similar to what was explained in the previous slides. Now, let us see how this endpoint URL can be used by a client. As an example, let us consider an example client, Bonaire, that wants to connect to CA Single Sign-On OpenID Connect Provider to retrieve user claims. All this should happen without manually configuring the other OIDC endpoints. For this demo, let us assume that Bonaire, the client, uses Apache Web Server with OIDC module. The OpenID provider information is configured in the Apache Web Server's httpd ssl.conf file. Let us take a look at the OIDC configuration in the file. In this highlighted section, we configured the provider metadata endpoint and specified the client credentials. We also defined the scopes that would be used by the client. In this highlighted section, the configuration specifies that the resource is protected by OpenID authentication type. When this resource URL is invoked, the configured provider metadata endpoint URL is invoked. Let us go back to the provider metadata endpoint. When you access it, the user claims are returned. Now, if you observe, we have specified only one endpoint URL, which is provider metadata URL. Authorization endpoint or token endpoint was not specified. So how does the configuration work in the background? Let us see. When an end user requests access to a protected resource through a web browser, the relying party, which is Apache Web Server in this case, processes the request and invokes the provider metadata endpoint. CA Single Sign-On as OpenID provider sends back the provider metadata as a response to the request. Then, Apache Web Server processes the received provider metadata, per the configuration in httpd ssl.conf file. It invokes the necessary endpoints to retrieve authorization code and tokens, and thus user claims. All these processes use the provider metadata behind the scenes. You have now learned how Discovery Profile for provider metadata works in CA Single Sign-On OpenID Connect Provider. You are all set to discover this feature. For more detailed information about this product, Click the information bubble in the top right corner to load the product page. From there, you can visit product documentation, support, communities, or learning paths. Thank you.